Afternoon from London, everybody. I know we have a really global audience today, so good morning or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to this webinar looking at digital ID and the creation of online verification, especially with learning for those countries that do not have a national ID card. Now, I'm Siobhan Bonita, a former UK civil servant, and I'm chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which serves civil servants all around the world. And I'm delighted that we have Boston Consulting Group today as our knowledge partner. So in terms of today's topic, one of the foundations of digital transformation is a single online identity verification system, allowing access to a wide range of public services, enabling better data sharing, and improving accessibility and value for citizens. But even for countries with an existing national ID system, building a digital equivalent is a complex task. Public service providers have to put their trust in new systems, rethink the way they manage and share data. Federal structures, weak central digital functions, and questions over accountability and funding all present obstacles. And for those nations without an existing ID system, it's positively daunting, with no infrastructure to build on, as well as additional challenges from low levels of public trust in government and concerns around privacy being particularly prominent. But despite all those challenges, many countries are creating solutions. And today we're going to hear from a fantastic panel of digital leaders sharing their experiences of creating digital IDs and looking at the challenges and the opportunities of online verification. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our great panel, but this is also a chance to say that once you've heard from our speakers, it's your opportunity to put your questions to the panel as well. And once we've heard from them, we'll get through as many of those questions as we possibly can before the end of the webinar. So please use, on whichever device you're using, you should see a Q&A function. Please use that Q&A function at any time from now onwards to send in your questions. And as I say, we'll get to those once we've heard from our panel. And now to introduce our fantastic speakers. So first we'll hear from Andri Christensen, who is the CEO for Digital Iceland in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs in Iceland. Digital Iceland is a cross-functional unit tasked with leading the digital transformation across the Icelandic government. Mr. Christensen is a product and technology visionary with over 2 decades of experience working in technology and entrepreneurship in Europe and Silicon Valley. Then we'll hear from Helen Ramat, who is product owner at the authentication services in the Estonian Information System Authority. An eID expert working in public sector and e-governance solutions, for the past 6 years, Helen has been mainly focused on the technical implementation of eIDAS in Estonia. That's the EU regulations on electronic identification. And this includes a close cooperation with public e-service providers, trust service providers, and partners from other countries. Then we head over to Norway. No, we don't. Then we go to our knowledge partner, Miguel Carrasco, who is Managing Director and Senior Partner at Boston Consulting Group. And he's also the global leader for BCG's Center for Digital Government. Miguel has extensive experience in private and public sector transformation and has led projects across a range of topics, including customer service excellence, digital innovation, digital identity, artificial intelligence, and the future of work. Internationally, Miguel has worked with a range of governments, including the UK, Canada, and India. Then we head over to Norway to hear from Tor Alvik, who is the Subject Director at Digitalization Directorate there. Tor has been involved in the development of public sector eID solutions since 2005. He's been responsible for the development, management, and operation of the Norwegian ID Gateway. And today, Alvik is responsible for the strategic development of eID in Norway and across the public sector. Internationally, he leads the Nordic-Baltic cooperation on eID and represents Norway on compliance with the European Union regulations. And last, but by no means least, we're delighted to have Dr. Saurabh Garg, who is the CEO of the Unique Identification Authority of India. With over 30 years professional experience, Dr. Garg has worked at senior levels across both the public and private sector and was also an advisor to the World Bank in the Office of the Executive Director for India in Washington, DC. In the Indian government, he's led a number of key transformation projects, including digitalizing agriculture and developing a direct income transfer scheme for farmers and at the Ministry of Finance, the formation of the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, improving foreign direct investment policies, and preparing the framework for digital payments. So I'm sure you'll agree with me that we have a really stellar panel with us here today. As I said, please do take this opportunity to send in your questions. That's a big part of today's webinar. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Andre to start and give us his opening comments. Over to you, Andre.
Great, thank you so much. And it's my pleasure to be here with all of you today. As mentioned, Digital Iceland is a part of the Ministry of Finance, and we sort of oversee the digital transformation of the government. Just to give you a little bit of context, we work across all of the ministries and about 165 government agencies. And we have a clear goal. And I think it's one of the things that has set us up for success. The political environment gave us clear goals. We have everything we need to achieve those goals of becoming one of the top nations in the world where it comes to digital services and e-government. It also helps with setting these goals when you're small, nimble, and can move fast. But sort of moving into sort of the digital IDs that we're going to discuss here today, I would say the situation in Iceland, I would divide it, there's sort of two topics I want to mention. First of all is the digital eID that we use to securely authenticate citizens when they are using digital services, both public and private. And we're actually very happy that the adoption has been really strong in the past few years. And we now have over 90% of all adults living in Iceland that have an eID that has the highest level of security according to IEDAS. So like the qualified advanced signature. So this has been instrumental in sort of transforming the country in terms of the digital services. Now, the second piece to the digital ID part is what we call digital IDs, where you present something. So as an example would be a digital driver license or any other sort of digital passes that people use to present to other people to identify themselves or prove certain rights. So these are the sort of distinction, whether you're in person showing or using your ID, or you're at your laptop or mobile and sort of securely authenticating or signing documents. And just giving you a little bit more context on sort of these two segments. So first is a digital eID. It initially started, so it was a government initiative within the Ministry of Finance that's put up the legal framework, but a company got started by some of the largest banks and telecoms. And I know there is a similar situation in some of the Nordic and Baltic countries as well. However, we went another path as it became sort of a monopoly with this one company. The government actually decided to acquire this company. So this company is now government owned, fully government owned. And this helped us to build up a little bit of trust because people were using this this mechanism to authenticate themselves. So this has been also, we've been subsidizing sort of some of the costs, particularly for government agencies, to sort of speed up adoption over the past few years. The second piece, and I'm happy to talk about all of this in more in depth later, I'm going to keep this fairly brief, is the digital driver license. We have over half of the population already using a digital driver license, which is fully equivalent within Iceland as the plastic driver license. And one of the challenges we had to face is we're small nations with sort of somewhat limited resources. You have to adapt to some of the native mobile solutions as much as possible. So we built this up as a pass in the native wallets by Google and Apple. It has a dynamic QR code. There's a scanner app and a mobile app for Digital Iceland, that's available to everyone to verify the driver license. But there's a lot of development in this space, particularly, which we can speak to further in this panel, such as we're partner of a Nordic and Baltic partnership, exploring some opportunities and development in this area around the European U-Wallet. So I think this sets the stage a little bit what we are focusing on in Iceland. I want to briefly mention as sort of an input into this panel and the conversation, some of the challenges that I think we're facing. So first of all, accessibility is a challenge. I mentioned over 90%, but what do you do with the remaining 10%? People with disabilities, elderly, kids, and so forth. That's an ongoing challenge for us. I think we all face in the digital transformation that people are adopting technology, they're starting to trust it, do they understand it? So we face some issues around the sort of people trust in these services. The third part is navigating the landscape of the fast-moving technology. I mentioned a couple of these big tech companies. There's also EU framework been in the process for the last few years, regulations coming, and sort of navigating and choosing the right solutions in this very complicated landscape with a lot of moving pieces can be challenging. And the last piece I want to mention, which I'll be happy to talk to some of my peers here, is how do we identify people cross borders? So a unique identifier between countries remains a constant challenge. And I think that's a big area that we need to solve so that we can start building out these more cross-border solutions. So with that, I'll end my short opening remarks and happy to take all your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. A really great way to kick off the presentation, because I think you've raised lots of issues there that we can expand on throughout the conversation. I like what you said about political leadership being key. Interesting what you said about how you could move fast because you're small and nimble. We will maybe put that to Dr. Garg and see how we can contrast that with how India has managed to do so well. But also what you were saying there, I think in particular about the role of the private sector companies as well as public sector and how in Iceland you've worked together on a lot of these solutions. I think that's quite interesting. And then really good to hear you raise 4 challenges: accessibility, trust issues, the fast moving landscape, and working across borders. I think all of those our audience will probably have some questions about as well. They're probably challenges they're thinking of. Thank you so much, Andre. Helen, I'm coming over to you.
Hello. I will start maybe just describing how our e-governance in Estonia works. Basically, it rests on 3 pillars, let's say. First is legislation. The second is the IT sector's capability to implement the government's vision. And the third is the trust of citizens for online solutions that government is providing for them. And the trust is one of the most important when it comes to the high uptake of the IDs. All Estonians, no matter where they happen to live, have the state-issued digital identity. It is a mandatory document, talking about the ID card, exactly. And it also has an EID functionality. It has been existed in Estonia for the past 20 years and is considered to be the cornerstone of the state. And the EID and the ecosystem around it is part of any citizen's daily transactions in the public or private sector, e-services. People use their EIDs to pay bills, do the government voting online, sign contracts with their digital signatures, shop online, or access their health records or information, and much more. Estonians also use their EID via state-issued identity as also secondary EIDs, which is one of them is called mobile ID. which is using SIM card technology. There's another private sector based EID, which is based on an app. They are all based on the public key infrastructure, but their the key storage system is a little bit different in each one of them. And also, since 2014, we have this e-residency program. Perhaps you heard about it, where anyone who wishes to become e-resident of Estonia can apply for it in their closest embassy of Estonia. And by having it, he can access to digital services regardless of citizenship and location. As this regulation affects all of us. We are in this together, especially in Europe. There has been other third countries outside Europe who have also catch the interest of implementing EIDAS-like regulation for mutual EID recognition. However, it has brought a lot of opportunities, of course, and in Estonia, the EIDAS regulation as is has been implemented, and there is some uptake, but not very high so far. And the main challenge, as previously mentioned, is the unique identifier issue, where many countries are unable to provide it due to their national legislation and restrictions by the law. But from our experience, the EID only does not help very much if you don't have a unique identifier, because that's the one number which you can use across different databases. In Estonia, we use this as the main key for the databases to connect a person to its records. And with the unique identifier, we always know that the person is always the same person when using different services, and we can collect the information from different databases based on that identifier. And when coming to identity proofing, there is this identity matching issue where probably more identity attributes could be required in the identity matching processes beyond the EIDAS regulation requirements. And as well, many countries are unable to provide such attributes, which makes this online authentication in cross-border terms a little bit complicated between countries. And in order to simplify the national implementation of and integration with the EIDAS regulation and alignment with a technical system, the Estonian Information System Authority has built a central authentication platform for the online service providers, which is based on a simple OpenID Connect protocol-based API, which provides centrally all those Estonian EID means, including ID card, mobile ID, smart ID, but also the cross-border EIDAS authentication, because that was based on a different protocol, and the common protocol we use in Estonia internally is OpenID Connect. That's like a platform service that makes the integration way easier for the public service providers than having them implementing this separately. So that the centralized approach in this case is justifying it. It enables a central security management, central mitigation, also has a balanced change management procedures. So there's a lot of benefits having this approach. As previously mentioned about the EU Digital Identity Wallet pilot project for mobile driving licenses, we don't have a digital mobile driving license today in Estonia. But this is something we are building together with our partners in Nordic Baltic Cooperation Network. And I will probably be engaged with this topic more in the question round afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. And I think it's good to see you build on what Andre said, interesting from Estonia, because you've been doing this, I think, for a couple of decades now, at least. How many how broadly it's used. So you mentioned lots of different use cases there, from government voting to paying bills. People can use their digital IDs for a whole range of services already. But also how then it's evolved. So it becomes quite complex when you say you've got kind of secondary IDs in there, the private sector developing apps as well, the problems with cross-border issues and everything, and how all of those things now you're trying to bring together in this centralized approach. So I think it just goes to show that even if you've been doing this for a long time, and even if you had the national ID mandatory identifiers in place, it's still not simple. There's still all of this complexity in the development of these. Thank you so much, Helen. Miguel, over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan, and hello, everyone. My pleasure to be here with you today. I am the lead for BCG's Centre for Digital Government, and we work with governments all around the world on this topic of digital ID. I would like to maybe just use the time of my opening remarks actually to share with you some of our latest research, which is hot off the press, and you're going to get a little bit of a sneak preview of one element of it. So every 2 years, we do a global benchmarking study, and we ask citizens about their use and satisfaction with digital government services. And this year is the 6th edition of this study, and we have done a deep dive specifically on some questions around digital identity. The survey covers about 41 countries and has about 28,000 respondents. The figures I'm going to quote are for the global sort of aggregate results, but of course we can break it down in more detail. And I think some of the topics and the points that have been raised so far, I would concur with the fellow panelists about some of the challenges that exist, particularly in countries that don't have a unique citizen identifier, and so there's often a little bit more work that needs to be done in order to establish the infrastructure and the solutions that enable digital identity to work in countries without a unique citizen identifier. And we're actually able to look at the results across the globe in our survey and split out the results for those 2 different groups of countries, which might be of interest. One of the things our starting point for the research was actually to ask citizens whether they even want a digital ID. And the findings from that question are that overwhelmingly people do want a digital ID. I think the overall result was about 95%. There's a small 5% of the population. It's not surprising that you often find a small minority that is resistant to any form of tracking or surveillance and things like that. But overwhelmingly, there is support and demand for digital identity by citizens. The other question we asked, though, was whether they would prefer to have a single digital identity or multiple digital identities. Here, it's interesting, actually. So there's about 30% of citizens who say they'd be happy and prefer to have a single digital ID. The next group was sort of around 40 to 45% who would actually prefer to have 2. And often the preference was to have one for government and one for non-government, wanting to keep those 2 parts of their identity separate, or to have one that was a high strength, high assurance credential versus a less secure one. So that was it was interesting. That was the largest cohort of customers would prefer to have 2. There's a small group who prefer to have 3 or more, about 15% or so. Sometimes that's because they would prefer again not to have everything centralized in one place and maybe have multiple different identities for different roles. And then finally, there's a small percentage, about 8%, who had no preference at all. So I think we can safely say that there is demand for it. There is sort of the overwhelming majority would prefer to have one or two digital IDs. The other questions we asked were things like, what would you use it for? Obviously there is, access to government services is one of the first things that people do with their, particularly with government issued digital identities. But there's also strong demand for being able to use your digital ID across the broader economy, sort of beyond just government services. So in particular, banking and health, accessing health services and health records, also for payments, and then to a lesser extent, things like social media, applying for jobs or employment, signing contracts and so on. But by and large, there is sort of a reasonable demand for a wide range of use cases across the economy. And finally, we also asked the question about who they would prefer to be the provider of their digital identity. And this is not surprising. The most preferred were high trust organizations like national and state governments and banking institutions. The least preferred were social media, loyalty and retailers, and credit bureaus. And somewhere in the middle of the pack are companies like postal agencies, technology companies, and the smartphone providers like Apple and Google. So some interesting guidance there in terms of what the users want from digital ID and who they want it from and how they would use it in the economy. We will be publishing this research, actually releasing it at the forthcoming workshop that we're having with the Global Government Forum. And there'll be more, obviously, that to say when we look at the different breakdowns. There are some nuances between developing countries and developed economies, and a little bit stronger demand from countries that have a unique citizen identifier as well in the data set. But hopefully some of that is useful context for the rest of the discussion. Thanks,
Miguel. Thank you, Miguel. Really useful indeed. We'll share that research with everybody who's registered for this webinar in due course as well, if that's okay with you, so they have the full.
Absolutely.
Really good to hear what you say about the findings showing that there is overall high demand for a digital ID. Interesting in terms of people wanting maybe more than one for different parts of their lives. But also interesting, maybe we can come back to this in the questions when you say, in terms of who people would prefer as their provider, people saying they want high trust organizations like national and state governments. I wonder if that's changes whether it's a country that already has unique identifiers compared to those that don't, because levels of trust, I think, vary across countries. So maybe we can pick that up in the conversation afterwards. Thank you very much, Miguel. Tor, I hope you're all right there with your video. So we're coming over to you now.
Yes, hi, I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Just want to start out to point that, of course, Norway is one of the Nordic countries. We share many of the characteristics that you have heard both from Iceland and also from Estonia. We are a country where we have a high level of digitalization and have had for many years. We have a population with a high level of trust in both government and also private entities that are used for digital identity that I will touch upon later. But also I might note that if you look at the map and look at Norway, you will see it's a very, very large country with a small population that lives scattered around the country. So the need for good digital services is in the cornerstone of every Norwegian's life. This is the way that you can carry out your business without spending a lot of time traveling, getting around. And back in the days about around year 2000, when we started working with digital identity, of course, then the scene was not that mature, but we saw that there was a user need in several areas, both in the banking industry, where you saw the emergence of internet banking, but also in the public sector, where we for many years have had a very modern taxation agency developing a lot of new services, and also had started to doing online tax returns for several years. We saw the need for more secure ID solutions. What then was done is that we looked at these user needs, and we developed first some eID solutions that were fairly simple, that could be used for basic services. This branched into the bank ID, which we know mostly used, which were used for online banking and basic banking service. Over the year, this developed to a high-level security solutions with a very high uptake. In Norway, we have tradition for public-private cooperation. We do that on many levels and have formal cooperation with both banking, financing, other industry areas, and now also inside agriculture and fisheries, as an example, where we develop digital infrastructure. This cooperation with the Banking Finance Institute, I think, has been the cornerstone of the success of digital identity in Norway, where we have provided a good digital identity that could be used for most sectors of life. You could use it just as easily when doing your online banking as going to the pharmacy to get your prescription, handing in your schoolwork, or looking at taxation, and so on and so on. For our public sector, I believe it's around 1,500 different agencies that are connected, and we are serving about 7,000 to 8,000 different services in a lot of different municipalities in Norway, that said, but also in the private sector, it is used for most aspects of life. Early on, we saw the need that we needed a framework and some common guidelines for digital identity. So our first version of these frameworks came in around 2006 to 2008. Now we have changed them and using, of course, the eIDAS regulation like every other European countries, but these early versions also shared a lot of the same characteristics. This made it possible for private eID vendors in Norway to build eID solutions that could be understood by service providers and underlying parties, and also could adopt them and put them into services. It was also possible then to describe them in legislation and trust them as formal ways of accepting digital services in many areas. So this, coupled with user needs, was some of the steps that we took early on, and maybe being quite important for the uptake we today have with digital identity. I think it's now around 94% of the population over 13, where we have eID on substantial security level and also high security level for all grown-up Norwegians. We also use digital identity heavily within for employees, both in the state and public sector, but also in the private sector. And they reuse the same solutions that are used for private services, but we have additional measures and infrastructure so that we can separate the services from private to employment use. So there may be some steps there that could be interesting for countries looking on how to adopt this easily. So as the rest of our countries, we share the same issues with cross-border usage. We have also unique identifiers, but also see the need to handle identity from large part of the world. We are a seafaring nation and have relations to countries around the world. So we have a lot of challenges also to connect into identity in other parts of the world, not just the EU. So it'd be fun to discuss this later with the rest of the
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tor. Interesting to get the perspective from Norway, because I think what you say there about the geography driving this, that's one interesting point there, need for digital services in a large country with a very dispersed population, but also I think reflecting some of the issues that we've heard from other panel members, the importance of legislation to embed standards, to embed security issues as well in there. You've got a high uptake like some of your neighboring countries, but similar challenges around some of those cross-border usages in particular. And then what you said as well about you had your own guidance, then having to revise it, I think reflects what Andre said about this is a fast-moving kind of landscape. Things are constantly changing. Thank you so much, Tor. And last but by no means least, we are going to get the perspective from India. To you, Dr. Garg.
Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here for the Global Government Forum's webinar. And I'm very happy to hear from my fellow panelists on how the digital identity is being implemented elsewhere. In India, we started about a decade back around 2009, 2010. At that time, we had different ID cards related for different functions, whether it's a driving license or for taxes or for various other subsidized foods, etc. And there was a felt need to have a kind of an all-purpose portable and something which is on a real-time authenticable for all residents. And over the past 10 years, now we've reached a stage that each of the 1.3 billion people in the country, in fact, all adults, 100% of the adults over the age of 18, have this digital identity, which we call Aadhaar, which translates into a foundation ID, if I can put it that way. It's called foundation. And it has the principles of having minimal data that is required. It's universal, as I mentioned, and it's anytime, anywhere authenticable. It has both the features of being authenticable online through a mobile phone or an internet connection through a PC, or on the card. If someone gives the physical card or the plastic card, there is a QR code which can be read, a secure QR code which can be read by a QR code reader, and one can verify the photograph and the name, etc. So it's both online and offline, given the diverse nature of the country that we have. Because now it's universal across all adults, it's being used for a variety of purposes. The banking sector is one of the prime utilizers for onboarding clients, for getting the know your customer, the KYC norms. It's being used across digital payments. The Aadhaar number or the ID number is also the financial address because it's linked to a bank account, so it can be used to transfer funds. And in fact, during the past 2 years, during the COVID time, the government used it extensively to transfer funds to the vulnerable sections using the Aadhaar system. And we have mini ATMs or the kind of POS, point of sale devices, the card readers, credit card reader kind of devices. So people could access and draw funds from them from any agent or any shop which had that which had that readers. So it really helped a lot during COVID also. It's being used in other areas, for example, attendance systems, attendance of public sector or the employees, you can use it. And it's a 12-digit random number, and it has the biometrics associated with it, which are securely stored in the systems. But those biometrics, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, that's fine.
So, so it's used across a number of state governments and central governments, and but I would say the main concerns going ahead are similar to what has been mentioned. Cybersecurity is something that we are very cognizant of because that's an area that we continually try to stay on top of the systems. The privacy of individuals that's something built in into our systems. It's privacy by design, so that we are in a way use blind. We don't know for what it's been used, and that's the way it's been. And going forward, I think the areas that we are really looking at is looking at other use cases where this can be used. One couple of other things, if I can just mention. One is that we use basically open source technologies. So we are not fixed on any vendor we use, and that also enables us to ensure that the open source technology systems make it so much more, if I can call it, secure. It also makes it a much more low cost model. Given the kind of volumes that we're talking of, 1.3 billion, it was necessary that we had a cost-effective solution. And we are working with many other countries, and we look forward to cooperation and ensuring that however we can contribute to building the global digital ID ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gao. I mean, fascinating to hear from kind of relatively small in terms of population countries to India, where you're saying, you know, everybody above 18, 1.3 billion citizens that you've managed to roll out the Aadhaar, the unique identifier. And you mentioned a couple of things there, which I think people might want to pick up on. The use of biometrics. I mean, to me, especially with that scale of population that you have, how you've managed to do that, and what maybe some of the concerns are around the security of that as well. And then your challenges, as you said, similar to what other people have said, but also wanting to expand the use cases. I think that's what a lot of other countries are thinking about. And really interesting to hear that during the pandemic, how you use this to actually get money out to some of the most vulnerable people in the society. So really good examples there. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel for sharing those opening remarks with us. It's really set the scene well for our conversation. I'm delighted to see we've got questions coming in already. Please do keep them coming from the audience, so keep sending in your questions. But I just want to start, first of all, by coming back to all of you, picking up on something I think that Andre mentioned right at the beginning about accessibility. And you've all mentioned quite high take-up of these digital ID identifiers. I want to know, is there a risk going forward that some people get left behind in this digital world, where people are increasingly required to have a digital ID to access services? So is there a risk that the most vulnerable, those who don't want to or who can't have a digital ID or can't operate a digital ID, that they are going to start to get left behind? Because this is something that's been asked in previous webinars that we've talked about. Is this a kind of consideration for you? Andre, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'm going to come back to you for your thoughts on how you're worrying about accessibility issues.
Yes, thank you. Yes, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think it's definitely a challenge. And I think it is a risk, as you mentioned, that some certain groups of society do get left behind. At least that is their feeling. People, elderly people, people with disabilities, they feel that they're being left behind. I think in many instances, we're actually, you know, at least in Iceland, and I think in most other countries in the world where I am, we're still just working on getting offline services, public services online. So it's not a matter of that. We don't have a situation where every single service, public service is online. So we're still just working on that. How we've approached this is we're building up some of our sort of what we call core services of Digital Iceland. One of them is a authorization service, so that people with disabilities, older people that may not have a phone or a smartphone, they can actually, in a legal way, assign their, you know, give someone else authority to act on their behalf. And so I think this is a critical part. We've gotten some concerns and some voices raising, saying like, well, you know, let's say I have a child with disabilities, I need to get that digital ID for my child. And it's a difficult conversation to have, because we've been fairly firm that you cannot have a digital ID from someone else, even if that person is not able to use digital ID themselves. So we have to have the security, the traceability, and that's where we're focusing on building these services so that if people are not in a position to use their digital IDs themselves, someone else certainly can on their behalf in a legal, transparent, and traceable way. So that is our focus. But I would love to hear my colleagues, because I don't think this is an area which has been sort of quote unquote solved yet. It's an ongoing issue we need to learn from and do better and better.
Thanks, Andre. And I'm going to come to the rest of the panel on this, but I just want to bring in, because it's a very related question from Stephen Nichols, who has said, do any of the participants issue an ID for Indigenous communities? Are there any unique challenges with accessibility or uptake? I think that will be more relevant in some countries than others, but I just want to throw that into the mix. Miguel, actually, maybe because you work with lots of different governments around the world. So just this issue of accessibility for individuals, but also maybe for particular communities as well. Is that an issue you've come across?
Yeah, it is. I think it's a universal challenge. I agree with Andre's comments, though, that the one of the common ways of dealing with that is to ensure that whatever digital identity solutions and framework you have allows the sort of facilitates nominees and third parties to act on behalf of someone else, if necessary. I think the other aspect is also sort of design and actually leveraging technology in a clever way. In some ways, technology reduces the barriers for some groups of people to be able to access services if they're done well, using voice recognition and so on can be very helpful for, say, people with disability. It's interesting that we don't see any difference in demand. When you look at the data that I was talking about before, there's very little statistical variation by age or gender or sort of geography. It tends to be pretty, so the results are pretty similar. So this isn't a sort of young people, old people thing, or remote rural thing. And the general, in terms of specific communities, I think that probably reinforces the importance of awareness and communication. So adapting to local language, cultural differences, I think is important. So we've seen in the rollout of some universal solutions, certainly one size fits all in terms of communication doesn't work in terms of take up. You need to have sort of tailored, highly segmented and targeted communications, in different languages, usually targeting the people that they respect. If they respect their elders, or if they respect particular change champions in those communities, it can be quite advantageous to get some of those people on board earlier.
Thanks, Miguel. Dr. Garg, I'm going to come back to you because, I mean, just the sheer scale of what you have to do to roll this out to everybody, accessibility must have been an issue for you as well.
Well, yes, and before I come to that accessibility, I would want to also mention that having an ID is so empowering for the most vulnerable. So I think the ability to be able to say who I am for a person who has no identity, who's not literate, who's living in remote areas is so empowering, and that itself, the benefits from that are really large. Having said that, I think two things I would want to say is that to ensure that the vulnerable and the remote people living in remote locations have an ID, we have to go that extra mile and ensure that they are enrolled and onboarded. And our public-private partnership is what we did to ensure that it incentivizes people to try and get everyone enrolled. That's number one. And the second, I think, is technology to keep it extremely simple and robust technology which can be used even in areas where there is no electricity and where there's no connectivity, to be able to have systems where you can go enroll them and then upload the data a day or two later, or systems which work even in the worst of terrains. So I think a combination of this and the fact that make the onboarding and enrollments process, which I mentioned earlier, as a minimal data, so that there's no too much documentation involved, which will ensure that a lot of people will not be able to get enrolled, but have the minimum documentation that is necessary.
Thanks, Dr. Garg. Helen and Tor, you're quite welcome to answer that question as well, but we've got so many questions coming in. I'm going to move on and ask you to the next question. You can mention accessibility if you want as well. But we did mention the cross-border challenges in all of the presentations, and Peter Hardcastle has asked if we could dig into that a bit more. So what exactly are the challenges in developing a single standard for digital identities that would allow the world to move towards trusted digital identity service? Helen, do you want to just give us a sense of what are some of the barriers to doing this?
One of the most common barrier we know is on the legal level, because of the different jurisdictions in different countries. The constitutional laws sometimes don't allow to forward specific identification data, which also is a barrier today existing eIDAS framework. That is one thing for sure, and that also prevents to agree on common standards, because we are coming from very different legal and cultural backgrounds that forces us to overcome this challenge, but unfortunately still ongoing. We haven't really agreed on a common solution that fits for all, but as European Union is currently developing this European identity wallet, and the eIDAS regulation is also under the review, we are hoping that the outcomes from those projects will give us some light.
Thanks, Helen. Tor, did you want to add anything on kind of the barriers to a global system, and also just how close do you think we are to ever getting there?
One reflection is that when we get users hitting our borders and asking for service, they come with a history, they come with a baggage. Most has been here before. They can maybe have benefits for both pensions, health records, banking records, and so on. And we have a lot of legislative problems, because then the level of information that we have on who are you in your home country might be lacking. So when we're going to match them, when you're coming with your new fancy ID, maybe with like Helen said, a limited set of attributes, it's pretty hard actually to match what you did there like 10 years ago. So I think it's needed quite a lot of investment in infrastructures and solutions to handle these problems. The eIDAS regulation that we have on European level today is not mandating this. This is a voluntary thing. Maybe that would change in the new legislation. And of course, the world is a lot bigger than just Europe. So when we are talking about this in a global scale, we also need to talk about what kind of standardization and so can we do, because legal framework that covers the whole world can be pretty hard to arrange, I think. So I'm afraid to say, I think on a global scale, we may be, this is quite in the distance.
Okay, thanks, Tor. Miguel, again, you're welcome to answer the question about global kind of system, one global system. But we've had a question in particular for you, aimed at you, and I think they were just asking about whether Canada was included in your research.
Yes, it is. That's one of the countries that was added in this latest edition, actually. So yeah, no, we'll be publishing the results for all the countries that are included, and Canada is definitely one of them. I mean, I think, you know, in relation to the comments around the global framework, I think there is some converging on open standards and some sense of interoperability. The key things, in my view, that need to be resolved is sort of alignment on the proofing, identity proofing guidelines, because they're not completely aligned globally. So that the levels of assurance need to be consistent. There needs to be some agreement on the technology protocols or the open standards that are going to be adopted. And then where a lot of these frameworks are tripped up is around the provisions around liability and the funding and governance models that sit around them. So they're not insurmountable, but certainly some big questions to tackle there.
Thanks, Miguel. There's a question here that I'm going to put to all of you from Narciso Zorzi, I think, and they've asked, have you or are you aware of any jurisdictions tying back digital ID to foundational data sources, i.e. birth certificates or immigration records? Helen, I think you mentioned that yours was tied to the population register. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, in Estonia, we have this national population registry, which was actually established a year after the re-independence of Estonian Republic. There they store multiple types of information, including these identity attributes in terms of eIDAS, which are first name, last name, your unique identifier, and date of birth. So all this data can be, in Estonian case, can be found from the eID certificate or from the population registry. In our authentication platforms, we normally retrieve the identification attributes from the certificate, which are easily available from there. And the other option is to use the X-Road data exchange layer platform for making a query to the databases like population registry or for legal persons attributes for this registry of legal persons and companies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we do have a national legislation and some regulations that relate to that regarding identity integrity with the data in the registries.
Thanks, Helen. Dr. Garg, I see you wanted to answer about the foundational data sources, but also the fact that somebody has just commented that they are in awe, same person, but they are in awe of the scale of your challenge.
Well, I must thank the person who's given that comment. But yes, it's been an awesome journey. On the foundational certificates, what we are working on right now is that going forward, we are looking at the possibility of issuing the unique ID at the time of birth. So when the birth certificate is given, simultaneously we give a unique ID also. So going forward, we hope to link it with the birth certificates, and that would help, I think, in multiple ways in ensuring that everyone gets the ID.
Thanks. Tor, I could see you nodding there at what Dr. Garg was saying. Is that a similar approach in Norway?
Well, I think without the Norwegian population registry and now unique identifiers, which is also issued at birth, we also have legal requirements for connecting digital identity directly and uniquely to the entities in the population registries. So without this, I don't think we would be able to succeed on the scale that we've done. We use the unique identifiers throughout all service areas in Norway, both public and private, and it's kind of your digital name. And without it, it's very hard to handle yourself. So for us, this has been a cornerstone in what we're doing.
Thanks. Andre, is that similar in Iceland as well?
Yes, indeed. We have a fairly similar setup to Norway and Estonia in terms of the unique identifier created at birth and a population registry linked to the eID service. I think the challenge with this, and this ties back to the question around the barriers to global, is when people move between countries or need to seek services between countries. So let's say an example, if you were to move to Iceland, you may have a unique identifier in your home country. You would move to Iceland, register with the National Population Office, population registry, and you would get a new Icelandic unique identifier, which doesn't necessarily match the one you have in your home country. And you could get an EID in Iceland. So you could theoretically have one EID in Iceland, you could have another one in Estonia, the third one in Norway. And so I think the key here is that we as a nation, and I think this is a global challenge, is coming up with a unique identifier across countries. So similarly, as has already been done with the banking system, where we have sort of at least a few systems emerging, like the SWIFT and sort of the IBAN that many of you are familiar with. So I think it's imperative that in the next few years, I don't think it's happening anytime in the next few months or even in the next few years, is sort of coming together and solving this challenge, because otherwise people will start having multiple identities across different countries.
Thanks a lot, Andre. Miguel, I came to you last on this issue of linking it to foundational data sources, because you mentioned in your presentation maybe the distinction between countries that already have a national ID system and those that don't. And do you think this might be one area where, for those that don't, this is going to be even harder because they maybe can't do that, linking it to things like birth certificates?
Yeah, I guess by definition, countries without a unique citizen identifier can't link birth certificates and immigration records and passports and all these registers together. And in some cases, they even have specific legislation preventing that from happening. And that really depends on, it's context specific. Different countries and different populations have different attitudes to privacy, different levels of trust in government, etc. In those countries without a unique citizen identifier, it's obviously been more of a challenge. How does one prove who they are without creating a new citizen register? There are technical ways of doing that, and I think actually the trend towards more decentralized models of identity could be the way forward here. And I'm talking about things like self-sovereign ID based on distributed ledgers, where it would be possible for a digital identity, a decentralized digital identity framework to exist. The key there, of course, is interoperability. So there's still a need for and still a role for government in those models to create the right framework for interoperability, for accreditation, and so on. And these are some of the challenges that countries like Australia, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, the US, etc., are dealing with, which makes them uniquely different to some of the other countries we've heard from today.
Thanks, Miguel. We've got so many questions to get through. We might not be able to answer them all before the end, because I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. But just to say to everyone, we will make sure your question gets answered behind the scenes if we don't manage to answer it now. And in particular, there are a couple of questions that are a bit more technical, so I'll make sure they get answered behind the scenes. But in this last round of questions, I'm going to put 2 questions to each of you, and you can answer one or both of these questions. So this is the final round of questions. So one very short and sweet question came in from Walter, who said, what are the advantages and problems of centralized versus federated implementation? And Helen, you talked about centralized system, I think, in your presentation. So pros and cons of centralized versus a more dispersed implementation system. And then I'm also going to ask Kathleen's question that has just come in, which is essentially, have the panelists, is there any quantifiable statistics on how having an EID has contributed to either growth in GP or any other kind of benefits that your governments are realizing? And that's either in terms of citizens' interactions with the private sector or with government using digital IDs. So what are the benefits essentially? Why are we doing this? So they're the two questions that I'm going to put to the panel. Andre, I'm going to come to you first.
Absolutely. So quickly, I think on the centralized versus sort of distributed or federated approach, our belief is that it's a hybrid approach. I think in the past, we were too much centralized, so it became a single point of failure. Then, over time, we did everything centralized, and then, different agencies were doing everything by their own, not really interoperating. So we've sort of taking the hybrid approach, where we're trying to keep some of the core services, such as identification, centralized, but then trying to open source all of our development and enabling different parts of the government and the private sector to actually use our services, code, and so forth. So I think that's sort of our take on that. Also, quickly, I know we're running out of time, around the statistics. We have some like anecdotal statistics about benefits. Obviously, there's a lot of services that have, just, the single point of digital driver license that really have changed the lives of people in Iceland. But I would say we're still in the early phases of sort of quantifying it and bringing out the real benefit. We are focusing now on measuring sort of 3 parts to it. One is just time saved. You're not waiting for the government for a long time to, solving your problem or helping you. The second piece is economical. So I think there's a lot of waste in terms of how government operates, both in Iceland and the rest of the world. We can become a lot more productive and do more for less in terms of our public spending. And the third thing that we are starting to working on measuring more accurately is the environmental factor, because people now are just using their laptops, getting service from home instead of driving between different parts of the town to go to different agencies. They're not printing out paper and so forth. So these are sort of the 3 key benefits that we are focusing on. But to be honest, we're in the early phases of really quantifying the impact.
Thanks, Andre. Helen, your thoughts on one or both of those questions?
I will start with the first question by Walter. In Estonia, we also have a very strong public-private partnership, which is already from 2001, since we start launching our ID card solution. And it's exactly for the same reasons as Iceland just mentioned, to mitigate the risks of single point of failure, also the centralized approach has its ways of benefits, but as we have this public-private partnership, we do have open source EID software which anyone can implement in their private infrastructure or wherever they wish to. So I think the hybrid model is a way to go further.
Thanks, Helen.
And regarding the statistics.
Oh yeah, sorry, Helen.
We do have some statistics, just a general information about the GDP. I do have a little bit of information regarding this, is saying that from the daily transactions per user in Estonia, it's saving approximately 2% of the GDP.
Wow, excellent.
And if you are interested in more statistics, I can probably get this afterwards.
Great, thanks, Helen. We'll circulate those to people if we can get those from you afterwards. Thank you. Miguel, over to you for your final thoughts.
Yeah, look, I think particularly again in countries where there aren't national population registers, I think there is hope that the decentralized models will provide a way forward. I also think the user control, or the idea of citizens being able to be in control of their identity and the information and who they share it with and what credentials they choose to store in their wallet and who they share those verifiable credentials with is a very powerful and potent idea that resonates a lot with users in today's environment. I think all the studies that we've done for various countries looking at the market opportunity, the use cases, etc., demonstrate that there is an enormous amount of friction in economies because we don't have digital ID solutions, or those digital ID solutions are only used in the government sector, or they're not economy-wide solutions. So and it runs into the billions, billions of potential economic value and savings in time and effort that people spend doing proof of identity checks, verifying documents. There's all the error and fraud that goes along with paper documents and things like that. And so, there's huge benefits there: improved security, improved integrity, efficiency and productivity, savings in the order of billions. And we've seen that time again across all jurisdictions.
Thanks, Miguel. Tor, your final thoughts as well, please.
Yeah, like the other Nordic countries there, we also have relied heavily on the private public cooperation, and the hybrid model it brings with it. It has been highly beneficial for all areas. Also interesting now in the future is now when we are moving into looking at the use of a digital wallet in Europe. What would that mean for the digital identity setup in Norway, and how we can use that in providing new and better services? I think it's very interesting. On the point of the value of digital identity, I think have to see, at least in our countries, that it has so clearly transformed our society, and on most levels, both private and public sector, and it's hard to separate the digital identity from how the whole society actually has changed when you are able to produce personalized services at that level. So I think it's the cornerstone of our digitalization work, actually. Without it, we wouldn't be able to succeed.
Thanks, Tor. And then Dr. Garg, finally over to you. How transformational has it been in India?
Absolutely. I'll focus on the second question because I agree on the first what's been said. 2 or 3 things I would want to say. One is because of the digital identity, the financial inclusion has really been impacted, and over 400 million bank accounts were actually opened using the digital ID that we had because of the Know Your Customer, and that itself would mean that access to savings, access to credit for a whole lot of people who did not have access to from the formal financial system, that's been done. The second, I would say, it's transformed the way government delivery of services has now been possible. It's been possible to think of programs which one would not have even dreamt of being able to do. And just to give one example is the cash transfers that have been possible, not only during COVID, but even to direct to farmers, to specific target groups. It's so much easier for the government to transfer funds in a manner which is transparent and clear. And associated with this has been the benefit of ensuring that any ghost beneficiaries are removed, duplicate beneficiaries are removed because of the matching that can be possible because of the digital ID. And there are actually estimates of how many billions of rupees that the government has saved because of this. So I think it's truly been transformational, the fact that every adult in the country has a digital ID.
Brilliant. Well, what a positive note to end on. I can't believe our time is up already. Just to say to the audience, thank you so much for all your questions. As I say, we will answer those we haven't managed to behind the scenes. You should find a questionnaire in your inboxes. Please do take a moment to fill that in, because it just means that we can continue to provide webinars that are most useful for you going forward. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, then you can continue with us. There's the details of another related webinar that we are doing next week on digital data and technology issues. All the information is there for you. But I would also like to say a huge thank you to our panel today for being so wonderful, giving us so much of their time. So thank you to Andre, to Helen, to Miguel, to Tor, and to Dr. Garg. Really brilliant conversation, setting out just how transformational this can be if it's done well. I think lots of food for thought there for countries that don't have an existing national ID scheme, but also being realistic about some of those challenges that lie ahead around privacy, security, and kind of those cross-border issues as well. We will be sending a link to everybody who registered with this video, so you can watch it all again or share it with your colleagues. And we will also circulate in the next week or so an article with all of the key points that were made in today's webinar as well, so that you can read that and share that with your colleagues. But that just leaves me to wish everybody a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you to our wonderful panel. Thank you to Boston Consulting Group for being our knowledge partner today. And I hope to see you all again very soon in another one of our webinars. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.